good afternoon, good evening, or maybe good morning. Welcome to the USC EASC New Book Series for Sinophone Studies. My name is Li-Ping Chen. I'm a Postdoctoral Scholar and Teaching Fellow in the East Asian Studies Center here at the University of Southern California. I hope everybody is taking good care and staying safe during these challenging times. This new book series introduces recent publications about Sinophone studies, and our theme for spring 2022 is border crossing. In February, we discussed how contemporary China circulates in transnational discourse. And today, we will talk about transnational Hong Kong style stunt work and performance. Next month, in April, we will look at the defectors from the PRC to Taiwan. You can find more information on our event webpage, and I will also share the link in the chat box later. I wanted to thank Sonia and Grace for their great support for this series, and also Alex and Caitlin for their help. Also, I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Society of Sinophone Studies. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Lauren Steimer here with us to talk about her new book, Experts in Action, Transnational Hong Kong Style Stunt Work and Performance. This book was published by Duke UP 2021. Lauren is Associate Professor of Film, Media Studies, and Media Arts at the University of Southern Carolina. Well, that's another USC. Her areas of specialization are Hong Kong action cinema, film exhibition history, stardom, labor, and the body. She has taught classes on Hong Kong cinema, Hitchcock, contemporary British television policy, the musical, action heroines, moving image pornography, and New Hollywood cinema. Our discussant today is Professor Po-Shek Fu. He is Professor of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research interests include Chinese studies, Hong Kong studies, cultural history, film history, war, and culture. He is the author of many books, such as Passivity, Resistance and Collaboration, Intellectual Choices in Occupied Shanghai, 1937 to 1945. Also, Between Shanghai and Hong Kong, The Politics of Chinese Cinemas. He also edited many volumes, for example, The Cinema of Hong Kong, History, Arts, Identity. Also, China Forever, The Shaw Brothers and Diasporic Cinema. Also, most recently, the Cold War and Asian cinemas. So today's event, let me say a little bit about the structure of today's event. Today's event will begin with author's presentation and continue with the discussing comment. After that, we will move on to the Q&A section. At any point during the talk, feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A box. And if possible, please include information about your affiliation. The Q&A box is located in your Zoom control panel. There, you will also find the closed caption function. Please note that the live transcript is automatically generated by Zoom. So that's all I have to say. And now that's welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Li-Ping. Can you hear me? Am I coming through? Thank you for inviting me. I am so touched that you invited me. I love what this center is doing. I am so excited by the work that you are doing there. This series is exceptional. I can't believe you invite someone like me to it. I don't, Professor Fu belongs here. I don't know if I belong here, but I'm excited to be here. I'm gonna share my screen and let's see, share. Okay, can everyone see that now? Yes, so that's the cover of the book, which is a lot more exciting than looking at me. And the book itself is not a book about Hong Kong cinema. It's a book more about the imprints and afterlives of Hong Kong cinema in other national and transnational contexts. The book uses the term Hong Kong style action, not just kind of on its cover, but a lot throughout. So just to clarify, Hong Kong style action is not necessarily action design in Hong Kong, but it is a collection of elements commonly associated with action design work from Hong Kong cinema from the 1980s and 1990s, 1970s as well, but most strongly the 80s and 90s. That includes stunting stars, so stars who do a lot of their own stunt work, Asian martial arts, not just Chinese martial arts, but Asian martial arts more broadly, complex fight sequences with multiple points of physical contact between cuts, and dynamic and fluid wire work. And I don't think I need to tell anybody that this started to become much more common in other national cinema contexts outside the Hong Kong SAR, starting in the late 90s, though of course there are earlier examples. It really started to gain momentum after the success of The Matrix. This research project took a long time to get done because it involved a lot of traveling and acquiring research grants to visit locations, to interview people, and to observe stunt work. To do this, to write this book, I not only had to watch the films and read the literature in the way that we normally do, but I had to study individual performers' training history so that I could read the ways that their bodies moved, as we don't really have a very good vocabulary for discussing body movement and discussing action. Often when in a script, when they get to the action, it just says they fight and they let the choreographers handle that. Well, in some ways, not in all, in film and media studies, we have had in the past a tendency when we get to the action to just start talking about metaphor or to skip it entirely and to not discuss the actual movements. So in order to do that, I wanted to make sure that I could speak to how bodies move in relation to their training histories. I interviewed stunt performers who are called stunties in the industry and stars. I went on set with Lucy Lawless and Dana Grant, who was her stunt woman on Ash versus Evil Dead. I watched them work together. I watched them design wire work stunts. I interviewed Lucy and Dana and a host of other stars and performers. I visited training facilities like 8711, like the Irish Stunt Guild as well. You can see here in the corner that when I was at the Irish Stunt Guild, I don't even think it's starting up, let's say. They lit me on fire. So I attempted to do stunts when they let me. I didn't ask. They often ask me. Stunt people are very giving. I wanted to learn how to do things so that I could speak to them more directly and more clearly. They were very, very giving of their time, and they still continue to be. I feel very fortunate to work on this topic and to work with a bunch of below the line laborers that are very happy to speak to academics. So I tried to get as much firsthand material knowledge as I could get. I went to horse training places, wire work training places, and I'm still doing this kind of work for my second book. I held the weapons, I played with the weapons. I can't see anyone's face, but I hope someone's smiling because I, in many ways, lived my 5-year-old fantasies by doing this research. The book itself is divided into 4 chapters and a conclusion. Introduction, 4 chapters and a conclusion. The first chapter is on Jackie Chan and the difference between his films in Hong Kong and Hollywood. As many fans have stated, or rather complained about, there's a major difference between Chan's Hollywood and Hong Kong films. I relate that to the insurance regulations that are necessary to produce films in Hollywood. And I discuss insurance in a bit more detail than it has been discussed in the past in relation to Jackie Chan's work. The next chapter is on the Hong Kong style model of action production as exported to Thailand. And I discuss Tony Jaa and Jia Yanin. The third chapter moves us even further away from Asia. And I discuss the production context for Xena Warrior Princess and stunt star Zoe Bell. Fourth chapter is on stunt teams. and stunt coordinators. So I discussed the work of the 8711 team, Chad Stahelski, who was Keanu Reeves' stunt double on The Matrix, and Dana Grant, who has been Lucy Lawless's long-term stunt double. And in the conclusion, I ask everybody else that's out there to please usurp my work, do this. Somebody else needs to get out there, do the work, interview the stunt performers, interview other people working on action, go and observe them, talk about the work that they're doing, because more of us should be paying attention to what happens on set. Now, I'm going to start reading. I'm sorry if it's going to get a little boring, but I promise you I have some really exciting clips thrown in there to distract you from my boring reading of my own work. So this is from the conclusion. The work of below-the-line screen laborers who are listed in the credits of film and television programs and discussed in craft publications is semi-visible in that their work is identifiable but disregarded or obscured by publicity materials consumed by screen publics. Their work is also only semi-visible in that classes continue to be taught and books written on directors and stars which make no effort to examine the collaborative nature of media production environments. It is possible, and I would argue necessary, to uncover the work of all of the members of the screen labor force along the invisible labor spectrum. Though this conclusion treads in familiar territory, stunt work, Hong Kong style action design, martial arts training, we can of course extend discussion of expert craft work to a variety of laborers along the spectrum and to labor and performance more generally outside the boundaries of screen work. An analysis of the semi-visible second unit labor necessary to spectacle production could be applied to a variety of genres because action set pieces are not limited to action as a genre. You can find action design in film and television, medical dramas, comedies, and even musicals. Increasingly, however, many US film and television productions in the superhero genre tend toward Hong Kong style action aesthetics in terms of both fight choreography and wire work design. This is due to three factors: the rise of the superhero genre under Marvel Studios, the in-transit circulation of Hong Kong style action techniques in stunt communities of practice, as described in chapter 4, where I explain that people learn from people from other contexts when they work on films transnationally, and the success of action design teams like 8711 and their compatriots in getting consistent work. Hong Kong style action design is common to segments of the Avengers series, the television programs Daredevil and Luke Cage, and other Marvel Studio properties. This conclusion identifies structural differences in the choreographed movement of stars and professional stunt doubles via analysis of the May versus May fight sequence in the Face My Enemy episode of Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. The distinctions between star and double are blurred both through editing, cinematography, and through the discursive erasure of the labor of the stunt double. When a star claims that she does her own stunts, and these claims are circulated by the popular press. This project incorporates research on expert performance to make visible the mediating mechanisms that distinguish expert and novice performance in the action genre, including deliberate practice in martial arts and/or other intersectional forms of bodily practice like gymnastics and dance. As demonstrated in previous chapters, expert stunt performers call on their histories of training when they learn and practice choreography and are able to store longer sequences of action beats than amateurs who struggle with memorization and comportment. Action genre actors like Ming-Na Wen commonly undergo very short periods of bodily training in which they're required to memorize very small chunks of choreographed action in order to manufacture on-screen credibility. In contrast, stunt doubles like Samantha Joe are required to draw upon their decade-long training, in this case, in the Chinese martial art of Wushu, as well as to memorize and actualize a series of complex choreographed chunks. The function of this performance analysis is threefold: to shed light on the material and mediatized histories of below-the-line action production, to promote further discussion of expert performance in film and media studies, and to recruit scholars for further research on expert performance and invisible labor. Most action stars and actors who star in action series make claims about their commitment to doing their own stunt work. Though, as explained in Chapter 1, there are insurance contracts and occupational safety regulations that prevent them from doing so. In previous decades, a scholar could watch an action scene and slowly identify moments when the actor's face was not visible and accurately assume the action was being done by a stunt double. But newer technologies have rendered those observational tactics useless. Stunt performers now regularly face the camera head-on during some of their most dynamic fights. Stunties' faces are now digitally erased with the use of performance capture technology, as tracking markers are placed on their faces, which allow the star's facial expressions to be superimposed. Given that performance capture gives credence to the false claims of action actors by matching their faces to the laboring bodies of stunt workers, quote, dynamics of visibility therefore may serve to obscure and even misrepresent those being viewed. It looks like we're actually seeing them doing the work, but in fact, it's a masking technology. The frontality of performance made possible by emerging digital technologies can provide a more immersive reception of an action star's body spectacle, but that corporeal presence and disposition belong to another performer. In contradistinction to Roland Barthes' remark on Greta Garbo's on-screen presence and the centrality of her visage that, quote, a mask is but a sum of lines. A face, on the contrary, is above all of their thematic harmony. The action star's face sutured to the body spectacle of the expert action performer is perceived as thematically harmonious when it is in reality just a sum of dots. With a little training in the mechanics of stunt production and in the disposition created by training in specific martial art or intersectional disciplines, it is possible for scholars to differentiate between novice and expert performance in action scenes, even when stunt workers' faces have been digitally erased. This process is necessary if we wish to make more visible the labor of stunt workers whose work has been hidden through discursive practices of promotional materials and the obfuscation of cutting-edge CG techniques. Expert studies pioneer Kay Anders Erickson has explained that differences between experts and novices should not be attributed to differences in intellect or perceived natural talent, but rather to distinctions in both the type of training and the period of training, because systematic differences between experts and less proficient individuals nearly always reflect attributes acquired by the experts during their lengthy training. In short, the spectacle of the imposed face on the non-stunting action star the spectacle of the imposed face of the non-stunting action star can be torn from the seams of the body spectacle because, as demonstrated in each chapter of this book, expertise leaves discernible marks. I discussed in the book that the mediating mechanisms for expert performance in stunt fight choreography are that one, a performer who has been trained for years, a stunt performer can do multiple fight beats in a row. So a fight beat is an industry term for articulated movement and point of contact. So a punch, a duck, an elbow, whether you're missing the other performer or not. If you're a stunt performer, you're trained to do 3, 5, 12, 20 in a row, and you can be trained to do that. If you're an actor, they'll train you to do 1 to 3 in a row. Actors who are doing it for a long time maybe get to do 5, but it's really very hard for them to expertly execute these things. And the degree of difficulty of the movements is usually minimal for actors. Two major mediating mechanisms that distinguish amateur and expert performance in choreographed action scenes are the number of fight beats a performer can chunk, learn a group of beats together, that's what chunking is, and the degree of difficulty and precarity of each movement. According to the publicly circulated material, according to the publicity material circulated via interviews with stunt double Samantha Jo and star Ming-Na Wen, They got it, quote, they got a chance to really focus on this fight on weekends, in between scenes, whenever there was a free moment, end quote. Ming-Na Wen trained with Zhou for 2 weeks off and on to prepare for the fight, which was then shot in 3 days. Actors commonly train with stunt doubles for fight scenes, and though actors like Wen with dance and martial arts backgrounds are reportedly easier to train, they are not stunting experts, and their performance is limited to short fight beat sequences with limited complexity in the finished product. All of the publicity materials for this scene implies that Ming-Na Wen fought Samantha Zhou. But in fact, the complex and high fight beat count sequences were done by Zhou and stuntwoman Tara Mackin, who is never mentioned in any of the literature. Wen's face was performance captured or PCAP'd onto both stunt women, and the stunt women shifted roles between Agent 33 in the silver dress and Agent May in the lingerie. Zhou, who was a member of the Canadian national wushu team at the Beijing Olympics and won a bronze medal at the 2007 World Wushu Championships in Beijing, was given the task of the most complex aerial maneuvers, and Mackin, who was trained in ballet, played a secondary role. Both Zhou and Mackin are able to use their previous deliberate practice training in bodily disciplines to deliver high beat sequences, and Ming-Na Wen is left with a tertiary role in the choreography with simple 1 to 3 beat sequences. While viewers are led to believe that Ming-Na Wen is doing her own stunts, 2 stunt women did the bulk of the labor, and one was never publicly acknowledged. We can, however, given our knowledge of form and training for wushu, clearly delineate Samantha Zhou's contributions and identify fight beats in which Zhou is working with Tara Mackin and not Wen, based on the precarity of the fight beats. There are 2 beats that were turned into GIFs by fans and members of the public and circulated in mass quantities. The double drop kick, here, let's see that. Right, we'll keep doing that until I stop it. So let me stop it. So the double drop kick, in this double drop kick, we can easily identify both Zhou's wushu training and the effect that this training has had on isolated muscle groups. As a wushu performer who specialized in forms as opposed to sparring, Zhou's quadricep muscles are more developed than either Mackin or Wen, and the knee to chest jumps that she repeated during her early wushu training prove useful in actualizing this maneuver. If you don't believe me, try this at home. Warning, you may injure yourself. Zhou can consistently obtain more lift from her jumps and is able to deliver a kinetic performance in which she jumps from a table to effect a variation of a butterfly kick twist while slamming Mackin's head into the table. Let's see this. Last time. That is accomplished without wires, without the use of wires or a harness. Mackin's ballet training provided her with the skills of coordination and made her accustomed to pain as she gets her head slammed into the table here, as it is an expected element of performance. But Samantha Zhou's wushu training is what makes it possible to produce this fight beat sequence without the use of a wire harness rig, because she can generate her own lift and momentum for the twist. The interviews and publicity photos make Samantha Zhou's labor semi-visible and Mackin's much less so. The performance captured image of Ming-Na Wen's duplicated face opened a discursive opportunity to publicly acknowledge the work of 2 lesser known stunt doubles. But the pull to aggrandize the work of the star in place of the stunt worker is too strong in US action productions. Technologies of stardom in the form of interviews, behind the scenes featurettes, and performance capture techniques operate to cement the public perception that action stars do their own stunts. If these technologies are to be believed, all action stars are stunting stars. But the mechanisms for identification and discussion of expert performance preferred in this book make it possible for us not only to prove otherwise, but to reconceptualize transnational histories of craft labor and laborers. The distinguishing quality of the body spectacle of the contemporary stunt laborer is the manner in which the spectacle of the star's face obscures the labor of the skilled expert body for most spectators. Most people don't know what they're looking at and assume that the star is doing the work. The unknown expert stunt worker shares many of the characteristics of the performers discussed in this book: training regime, spectacle production, endurance of physical discomfort. The body spectacles analyzed in this project are closely connected to visible star bodies. The spectacle of the action star in the eyes of most viewers seemingly divorced from the physical labor of the stunt worker seemingly divorced from the physical labor of the stunt worker. In chapter 3 on stunt woman Zoe Bell, I argue that Bell's labor was obscured in the act of becoming a spectacle. This attribute is shared by all stunt workers, but the work of below the radar stunt performers sheds light on the area of concern for further research: the separation of the star as an object and the labor inherent in stunt production. One of the topics touched upon by this book has been the work of secondary unit crews and much of the off-screen labor required for the production of spectacle. The last chapter on stunt coordinators attempted to shift attention towards such issues, but the topic should be addressed in much more detail. Approaching stunt workers as experts and studying stunt communities of practice makes it possible for film and media studies scholars not only to identify the material conditions under which action aesthetics are realized, but also to map the transnational flow of technology and technique and historical shifts in practice, while simultaneously making stunt labor more apparent and fighting the discursive strategies of technologies of action stardom. In order to make stunt work more legible, we must first speak to stunt workers and stunt communities of practice about the conditions of production for their labor. This process also requires research on the training histories of individual performers, interviews with stunt workers and actors, on-set observation, visits to training facilities, and first-hand material engagement with the stunt production process. But most of these techniques require access to the industry and considerable research funding. For scholars of action design without these resources, the first step is to become as fluent as possible in craft language, performance technique, and the terminology used to discuss comportment and movement within the bodily disciplines evident in the performer's training. If we wish to call ourselves experts in action, we must learn how to identify the work of action with greater precision than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for introducing your book, and especially focused on this unrecognized labor of the stunt works, and then also to show us these amazing videos about this kind of force and momentum. Often that's just amazing, in addition to your arms on fire. So that was just amazing. Thank you for sharing. So now I will pass the time to Professor Fu.
Hello, hi, everybody. First of all, I want to say thank you to Li-Ping and EASC for inviting me to comment on Lauren's very interesting new book. And I think the book not only give us bring us to attention to a lot of very important vocabulary to understand and to analyze all these, what she called the embodied technologies of this martial arts film. But I also too, I especially like what she said about the approach of she using the material history of the particular body spectacles that brings together really a various social, political, economics, and even regulatories and insurance, all these forces that help shape all these action film, and especially the expert in action behind. That I think I really appreciate this book. I learned a lot from this. But Lauren also argued that Hong Kong style action is both rooted and rootless. And she explained a bit in her presentation just before that. And that is only looking at the imprint of Hong Kong cinema, and especially in its globalized circulation and transaction. But still, I think since she talked a lot in her book about the Hong Kong style martial arts or action film aesthetics, and she did all this research or historical research. So I do want to have a conversations with Lauren here about the root that in the historical sense of how Hong Kong style martial arts action cinema was developed, and might perhaps provide some context for our later discussions. And in fact, I think Hong Kong style or just Hong Kong action film cinema seems to be more diverse and more hybridized than what the book seems to suggest. And I think this is just a conversation with Lauren and the audience, so it's a way just to discuss and for this conversation. So I want to, I think, better to use some images to go along with this, telling this story about Hong Kong's beginning. And before that, I would like to say one thing first too. I think Lauren may have heard that. I mean, her first chapter is on Jackie Chan, on Sing Long. But a very new documentary film called the Kung Fu Stuntman, which was directed by a new director from China and sponsored by the Hong Kong Stuntman Association, which was founded in 1993. And one of its purpose was to try to get insurance and also support financially for many of the stuntmen who are really in difficult time right now. So, and then in this stuntman thing, there almost every big, small stuntman was there in the movie, except one person, Jackie Chan. So go figure it out. I think that might be looking in some of the politics. Maybe this is also part of the material history of that. You look at that. But why don't I talk about the root in the historical sense of these Hong Kong style action movies. And let me try to share screen here. Okay. So for the first thing, I think we have to look at two. One, it was in China, on the mainland, not in Hong Kong, that martial arts movie or other film were considered superstitious and were criticized. So, and then in fact, it was only when the Shanghai migrants to Hong Kong during the Second World War or Civil War, who criticized Hong Kong movie as superstitious and backward, but not for most people here. Now, this is I think one of the most important the context for this action film in Hong Kong. In 1930s, when there's a lot of criticisms of these movies in China made martial arts movie were superstitious and not good from this May 4th discourse. And one of the most important martial art stuntmen start to come to Hong Kong. In Xiu-Tin, he was the father of Li-Ping. So he was invited, he was at that time a well-known Peking opera performer. He was invited by a Cantonese opera a manager and also performer to come to Hong Kong to play in his things. So, and Yin Xiuting came along with quite a few of Peking opera and other martial arts performers to come to Hong Kong to escape all these criticisms and attacks of them being superstitious and backward and uncultured. So come to Hong Kong and start to get involved. Now, here we can see this at the very beginning. This is a film in 1957, a Cantonese martial arts film. Now, this we all know, Guan Deheng, who was famous for his Wang Fei Hong, that Lauren also discussed in her book. But Guan Deheng was a Cantonese opera performer and also martial artist. And same as Chu Dao too. But here, if this is a person, I think like Zoe Bell that Lauren talked about in her book, chapter 3, I think that's a chapter I like most. Yi Shou Chao was a senior of all these Peking opera person who come to Hong Kong, and she played in Hong Kong Cantonese movie and dubbed in Cantonese. So in 1957, it was already a mix of Cantonese opera performer, Peking opera performers, along with Cantonese martial artists, Southern style, who make this movie. And Yi Shou Chao was here, the daughter of Yi Jinyu, right? The masters of this Hong Gambo, Sammo Hong, and this Jackie Chan, and Yun Chao. All these people here. So she is here to work with them, but they come here to Hong Kong was mainly to stay away from all this critique and come to Hong Kong to teach Peking opera. But in Hong Kong, Peking opera was the most marginal thing. So they know that they have to work to provide for the movie industry. First, for Cantonese movie industry. Now, you can see here, this is Guan Deheng in his movie. So it was much, much earlier than Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung in the 50s and 60s. He already started, there must be a combined, it is a Peking opera, Cantonese opera, and then local Southern style martial arts that he used objects, as Lauren, a very nice quote she used, to use just objects as props from the mise-en-scène to use it as a weapon to fight and get audience excited. A fan, an umbrellas, or a broom, or whatever you can find, or a chair or a table. So, and it's here in this Cantonese movie already in the 50s, 1950s. This is Yun Xiuting. This is Lao Zhang. Lao Zhang was the grand disciples of Wang Fei Hong, to real Wang Fei Hong. And then this is Shen Yinji. She came here also from Shanghai. So this is already in Wang Fei Hong's movie. It's a combined Peking opera performer martial artist, Southern style Cantonese opera martial artist, both as the first generation of action coordinators, helping with all we call the Wang Fei Hong's movie, Cantonese movie. So it was from these beginnings. And we can see this also the second generation of that. So this is Lau Ga-Leung. I think we all know for all his movies. So Lau Ga-Leung was the child, was the kid of Lao Zhang. And Tong Gai was the favorite disciples of Yun Xiuting. So it was their generation come to dominate all the Cantonese movies, martial arts movie in the 60s, and also in the Shaw Brothers. So it's not because of Shaw Brothers ran out of people who need to find Peking opera people, but these were already available and they work for Shaw Brothers, the best studio. And then the Lau Ga was Southern style, Cantonese opera, and Tong Gai was the Northern style and Peking opera. And they always work together to first show that a hybridized, converged action cinematic style in Hong Kong's martial arts action movie very early on. Because Southern style and Northern style is very different, but then they supplement together. And Shaw Brothers make not only short fighting movie. This is the very important group, David Jiang and Di Long. And Di Long, we all probably remember him, right, in the A Better Tomorrow by John Woo. So these are all curated by Tong Gai and Lau Ga. This was a team work for all the movies for the Shaw Brothers. These combined, converged, Northern, Southern, Peking opera, Cantonese opera style. And again, this is someone, the Chen Guntai. He's not related to opera. He was simply a martial artist and involved probably in triad, whatever. So, but there was a lot of these people here who involved into the action films, stuntmen. Some are operas, some are simply martial artists. So he came from a school, a style called the Dai Sing Pek Gua, a very famous Southern style martial arts, very similar to the Northern style, big and very high kick and all the things. So he becomes one of the big stars of the Shaw Brothers, but also curated by Tong Gai and Lau Ga. So and I think this, and then here was the Lau Ga. His movies here, the 36th Chamber of Shaolin. And this one is about the use of the most typical local Cantonese things, the bamboo building things. So, and this Lau Ga fight, the Lau's family team. So this is all these movies of the Shaw Brothers. And in the way they try to localize Shaw Brothers movie to make it more Southern style, to appeal to the new audience in Hong Kong. So, and then another famous one, Han Yingjie, Hong Yingki from Beijing. So he was the son-in-law of Yu Jinyun, the master of Jackie Chan and all the things. He started to work with King Hu, and then he joined the Golden Harvest, worked with Bruce Lee. And because of that, he brought Jackie Chan, he brought Sammo Hung to Golden Harvest. And from there, they developed. So, and then later on, here was Xi Yun, make a very important movies, Nam Quan Bat Tui, that means Southern boxing, Northern kicking. So, and then he also make Drunken Boxer, right? Drunken, that is by Jackie Chan, all the thing. And he start to use Yu to be the coordinator. So it is from this Southern, Northern, Peking opera, Cantonese opera, martial arts, opera, all these very mixed. And for the stuntmen, most of them might not join anything, but one thing is for sure, all of them came from very poor families. And that's why they put their life on the line to make the best movie in order to survive and also to be good. So in fact, in Shaw Brothers, even though it was a bias against him, Shaw Brothers make films is less risky and dangerous because big studios. But with the decline of the Shaw Brothers studio, with the Golden Harvest, Cinema Cities, Golden Princess, all these smaller or satellite studio, it make Hong Kong cinema, yes, more dynamics, much more prosperous, and it's golden age of Hong Kong cinema, but it also put a lot of these stuntmen in big risk in order to make a great business. So Jackie Chan, Sinophone, or other pushed the stuntmen and themselves to do the best stunts as they could in order to make the movie competitive in an extremely competitive market in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and as Lauren mentioned, in Thailand, and then in other parts of the world. So this I want to here, I think this is what I want to talk about this. So I just think that it is a much more diverse, very hybridized, and also it is something many people to survive, to join this thing. And then because of happen to be in a timing that after the decline of a big studio, the rise of this Kung Fu interest, so make all these people to come together. But it never will be one single style or single origin. And they start with, interestingly, people who fled, who move away from Shanghai and Beijing to come to Hong Kong and invited by a local Cantonese opera people. And then they start to hold these convergence and hybridizations of Hong Kong martial arts cinema and make it into such an exciting genre that Lauren put it very well in her book. And also here, I just want to mention that with all these different schools and things like that, I would like to ask Lawrence too, and to start maybe the things. You know, she mentioned two things here I find it very interesting. She said that Jackie Chan, because of aging and being regulated out of stunt work, so the Hong Kong style action aesthetics have reached a moment of transition. And then she moved to Tony Jaa in Thailand. Actually, Tony Jaa is one of my favorite actor. I really like his style, but compared to Bruce Lee and things like that. So did it mean that regularly out of stunt work in US or in Hong Kong, or just Hong Kong going to be a new cycle? Because of all these new wave directors, it was a time of Hong Kong becoming of this nostalgic of the old movies in the face of the 1997 return to China. So all the films they made were all remake of 1950s Hong Kong Cantonese martial arts cinema or Shaw Brothers cinemas movie titles. All of them, almost all of them, like the new Dragon Inn and all the things. So I just think what did Lauren really mean in here? And also, I find it very interesting that she said that Jackie Chan, because of the insurance things, had to leave Hollywood. And it was at the same time that Hong Kong stuntmen began to look for insurance. So and also I think it would be nice if Lauren can compare Jackie Chan with the experiences of Sinophone. He made the TV series Martial Law, and also with John Woo or Jet Li's experiences. I think it might be interesting to put this in context. But saying all these things, I just think that I really enjoyed Lauren's book. It is a very exciting book, and I learned a lot of it from it about the action films. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fu, and especially to introduce this kind of dimension, as Lauren discussed in the book, this rootedness and also rootlessness, but thinking about the roots of the Hong Kong style. But I really appreciate that you mentioned that it's a hybrid model of that roots, have so many different elements, and then this kind of like combinations or conflicts of different elements, and then the continuation to form that style for the kind of becoming of the Hong Kong style. And I also appreciate that you mentioned their unrecognized labor, especially in terms of the issue of class, because they are from humble background, and that's why their life is in this kind of high risk work situation. So now I was wondering, Lauren, would you like to respond to the comments?
Yes, please. Thank you so much, Professor Fu. It is an honor to get questions from you because I've been reading your work for so long. I have learned so much from what you've written, and the questions you've given me here are excellent. So first, I want to start with this issue of rootedness and rootlessness and Hong Kong style action versus Hong Kong action. I don't actually discuss Hong Kong action a lot in the book. I discuss Hong Kong style action. And Hong Kong style action, you're absolutely correct. There's a gap there. There's an absence there in terms of the immense hybridity of Hong Kong action design. Hong Kong style action, that is to say, elements from Hong Kong action as they find their way into transnational stunt productions elsewhere, are a lot like Chinese food in the US, in that there's something slightly familiar, but it's really lost the richness and the complexity and the regionality. That happens for two reasons. It happens, first of all, because I should say instead of two reasons, there are two ways in which action design tend to infiltrate an area. So the action design from Hong Kong, it either crossed over because of contact zones in which stuntmen are working with stuntmen from Hong Kong, or it crossed over because people in other locations watched Hong Kong action films. Now, one of the most horrible and heartbreaking things is that I love Guandoking. I love him, and I love Cantonese action design so much, but I can't show it to my students because none of them speak Cantonese, and they don't generally subtitle and export Cantonese action films. And they didn't also do it in the day. I guess they just didn't understand that there could be as big an overseas audience for it, where the Shaws were more invested in subtitling in overseas audiences, as were some of the other studios. So the stunt communities don't really get to see the original or the longest running Wong Fei Hong, right? They get to see some Jet Li, some Jackie Chan, some Donnie Yen, a few others, but they don't get to see the amazing work he did. And you're absolutely correct. He was not just, he was an opera performer. The way that he moved his body, he could take a brush to write a name or a slogan and turn it into a martial arts set piece where he's fighting someone off. It was very, very gorgeous. That's missing from Hong Kong style action. The kind of eloquence of Peking opera comportment and movement is missing. And that's a bit heartbreaking. So when we talk about contact zones and stunt people learning from other stunt people, initially in the 1950s, there were some Hollywood and French production units over in Hong Kong, probably people from other countries as well. But the stuntmen didn't take the stunt work that the Hong Kong performers were doing seriously. They very sadly kind of saw it as kind of low rent or cheap aesthetics, so they didn't learn from them as much as they should have. They only started to really learn from them much later in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and very, very strongly in the 90s when there was kind of more mixing on sets. So when I say that Hong Kong style action design is rooted and rootless, it is rooted because there is this incredible, beautiful material history, but because it is distanced from that, because the contact zone is imperfect, and because the circulation of Hong Kong action and knowledge about forms and styles and different styles of opera is missing in other national contexts, it loses it becomes distant from its origins. And so it becomes like Chinese food in the United States. It's there, you know, you want it, and you want to go to you want to see the best possible version of it, but there's always something that's not quite there. The diversity is absolutely positively missing. Some other things here in terms of stuntmen and the risk, and stuntmen and stunt women. There is And you said that you liked this chapter on Zoe Bell, and that touches my heart because that chapter, I think, one of the points I tried to make there, and I make again in the chapter after that, is that there are locations in the world that are so desperate to compete in the Hollywood market that their labor forces are offering up their bodies. Thailand is a case, but like New Zealand is a weird case. New Zealand in the 1990s, stunt performers are just like, what do you want me to do? I'll do it. And they did injure themselves horribly because they were just so excited to be asked, so excited to be making a globally distributed television show. And we see the same thing happen again here. More recently, Amazon produced a Lord of the Rings thing in New Zealand during the pandemic when everything's been shut down, because where do you go to? You go to a location that, you know, they've kept out all of the outsiders and they're willing to do whatever they have to. And it was absolutely horrible conditions on set. And Dana Grant, the woman who I talk about in chapter 4 and is commonly Lucy Lawless's stunt performer, was injured so badly on the set of the Lord of the Rings TV show that she essentially had a brain hemorrhage and went blind in one eye, and has been recovering her sight for months upon months. The dangers that stunt people will expose themselves to are absolutely positively tied to the economic conditions of the region in which they are producing things. So I feel comfortable saying this, that the stunt community in New Zealand is not really as poor as the stuntmen in Hong Kong in the 1970s were. Many of them who were not from prominent families, not like Sammo Hung, they were truly like working to eat. So they would do whatever they could, but there is a similarity in terms of the desperate desire to compete in a world market and to get the skills and to demonstrate that you have the skills. In terms of insurance, it's really, all the Jackie Chan questions are just so incredibly interesting. And I'll get back to why he might not be in that stunt documentary, which I think you already know. But Jackie Chan leaves the US for a few reasons. One, yeah, sure, the insurance means that he can't really do the same kinds of stunts that he can do in other contexts. Yes, he's aging, but it's also because the kinds of contracts that they had where they got paid in advance from exhibitors all over the world to make Jackie Chan films, those dried up for a while. And then Hollywood is very superstitious. So they think if something stops working, they just have to stop. This is why there were like the Shanghai movies, the Shanghai Night, Shanghai Noon. And there were I don't know how many, 3 or 4 rush hours, because they were getting paid in advance from movie theaters in like Spain, in all across Europe. And so they had this money that was, and they made tons of money off of those films because they were easy to finance. So even though the action design in them is not as complex, they were incredibly easy to finance. And then that well dries up. And Jackie Chan leaves the US. That well has now resurfaced. So post-pandemic, we actually might see Jackie Chan maybe return to the US a bit. But we know that he's older and that his movement is limited by the insurance restrictions and the labor restrictions. But the man does enjoy getting paid. So I'm sure that he will come back to the US once those contracts for those theatrical contracts come back again. As to why he's not in that stunt documentary, which seems like an aside, but it's such an important question. The Stuntmen's Association in Hong Kong, which has stuntmen and stuntwomen, has been struggling so hard. Sammo Hung has been still, from what I've been told, more deeply connected to that stunt organization. But one of the great difficulties, and this links to the question you had asked me about, cycles in Hong Kong cinema, is that while in the 90s and 80s, they were remaking films from the 50s, as we all know, they're now remaking a whole bunch of films from the 90s in mainland China. They're remaking successful Hong Kong films and trying to reconnect to those aesthetics in mainland China. Most of the work, stunt work, is going to mainland stunt performers and not necessarily going to Hong Kong stunt performers. So they're in a way starving more than ever. Jackie Chan, as I think many of us here probably know, has distanced himself from Hong Kong and aligned himself with mainland China for quite a few years now. And he's also brought a lot of production, or has been linked to a lot of film and television production activities in mainland China. He doesn't seem to be working really hard to get people from the Stuntmen's Association in Hong Kong jobs across the border. He doesn't seem as connected to that history as, for example, Sammo Hung is. Let me see if I can go back. You asked me a question about Sammo. Sammo in the States, he did have the same insurance restrictions as Jackie did, but Sammo faced a lot of problems. One, Sammo was one of the earliest Asian action shows with an actual Asian man in it, unlike Kung Fu, in the US context. And the television producers had difficulty exporting that show internationally. They didn't have difficulty exporting it to parts of Asia, but they did have difficulty exporting it to parts of Europe and parts of Latin America. And because of that, you know, Sammo show was canceled long before it probably should have been. But the kind of work that he could do there in terms of the action work was so limited compared to the work he had done previously. And he didn't have the kind of power on set that he has in Hong Kong. That's one of the things that was really consistent in the 1980s and 1990s. Stunt coordinators, fight coordinators, they didn't exist in Hollywood. They were not the fight coordinators did not exist. It was just the stunt guy that they bring in, and the stunt guy would tell other people what to do. So with people like Sammo coming onto set and saying, you know, I'm a producer on this, I'm a star on this, I'm going to tell you how the action should go. There's absolutely zero respect for that. There was zero respect for that among the stunt team, who wouldn't respect an actor telling them what to do. And there was just zero respect for that on the production itself, because in Hollywood, there was no concept of this kind of complex fight choreography that required someone to be in charge. It was only years after this that fight coordinators started to become a category in the US. So this was really hard for people like Sammo. It was also hard for Lok Arlang when he came over to do, what was it, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He was connected to one of those films, and I think the second one maybe, he was absolutely appalled at what they were doing in the action choreography, and he tried to offer suggestions, and they laughed him off as an old man. On a Hong Kong set, he would never have been treated that way. He was, you know, a master of decades upon decades of work. He had worked with the greatest performers. He had designed some of the most historic action set pieces. But on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, 2, on set in the States, he's just some old Chinese man wandering the set telling them they're doing it wrong. So you're really dealing with very different systems. I don't know if I got to all of your questions. And if anything I didn't answer, please ask me again and I'll happily answer, because these are excellent questions. And I love talking about this stuff.
Thank you, Lauren. And I guess now we can include the questions from the audience. And then for our audience, again, the reminder, welcome to submit your questions through the Q&A box. It is located in your Zoom control panel. All right, so let me take a look. First of all, I guess there's one question in the first question is about, I guess all of us also wondering that the beginning of this project and how do you got started, and also maybe just, you know, personally interested in this subject for your book, for your research, but just for you as well.
Thank you for that question. So in the early 1990s, I was an undergraduate at NYU. I did my undergrad, master's, and PhD all at NYU. They tell you don't do it all at the same school, but by the time I was a grad student there, we actually had people working on Chinese cinema as professors that I could work with. But in the early 1990s, I was like 16 years old. I went to college early, and Chinatown was right there. I was a kid from New Jersey, and I was just so excited to be in the city. And I was constantly trying to go see movies in Chinatown. I was trying to see movies at or rent movies at Kim's Video, which was an entity in New York, to see every Hong Kong movie I possibly could. And at this moment, Hector Rodriguez, who is a scholar of Hong Kong cinema, and Linda Lai, they were also at NYU as PhD students. And the culture in the department was just infused with this love for Hong Kong cinema. It was really just kind of, exploding in major cities with Chinese populations. And I was fortunate enough to be in one and to be going to school in one. And to have access to, to be able to go down to Chinatown and rent, to get the books that they have out and just point and say, I want to see this one and this one and this one, and take them out. It was one of the absolute best times of my life, being able to go to Chinese video stores and come back with just a pile of VHS and later, VCDs and other things. I was so excited. And when I became a graduate student, I also started to go to Hong Kong. Well, when I was an undergrad, I went to Hong Kong, but I started to go to Hong Kong and try to collect everything I possibly can, all the books, everything the Hong Kong Film Archive put out. If there was a book that you could not get in an American context, I bought it there. I spent all of my money on that. I don't think I had money for anything else in my life except that. I was so skinny at that point in my life because I would not spend money on food. I would only spend money on Hong Kong stuff, scholarship, or like movies. And I was just enamored with the style of action design. What also happened is that I ended up, undergrad, master's, PhD in a program for a long time. And then I was teaching out at UC Irvine. And I realized that I have been doing film and media studies since I was a teenager. And, I needed to kind of, what would they say, like resist the father, I suppose. So I was kind of like, I've been trained in textual analysis, genre analysis, historical analysis, historiography. People are already doing these things, and they'll do them much better than I would in Hong Kong on Hong Kong cinema. People from Hong Kong had already done that work and continue to do that work. I thought, what can I do? What are people not doing? And the heartbreaking thing for me is people weren't talking about the action. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they will contextualize Cantonese, Southern styles, Northern styles. Gina Marchetti even has been doing some of that work recently. And I love that. And they will talk about opera, and they'll talk about elements from opera that are used in particular performances. But most of the work in film and media studies do not discuss performance to that degree. Additionally, I was a kid from a working class family, a truly working class family. So I was very invested in invisible labor. Other than going to school, I was also helping my mother's third job running a cleaning business, cleaning rich people's houses. So I always just wonder, what's going on behind the scenes? Who is not being talked to? So I am incredibly invested in finding out how stunt workers learned what they learned and how they put it into action, mostly because people just, they erase that. They don't like to think about that. Even my students now, when I first taught I've taught Hong Kong action for years, but when I taught it in South Carolina for the first time, where the students had not had a lot of experience with Hong Kong, one of the students said to me, and it broke my heart, said, I don't really care about the stunts or the stunt people. I just care about the stars, Lauren. I don't care if they're, and that hurt me, because I'm like, these are incredibly talented, skilled people who have trained for years. One of the things that makes some Hong Kong stars different is because they can do these things. And I encountered a few people in an audience that are like, I don't care, because I watch Hollywood films and I just assume that the stars do everything when they don't. So actually proving to people, demonstrating to people that we should pay more attention to action and to the people who are doing it, that was really important to me. And I've talked a lot, so I'm going to be quiet now. Sorry.
No worries, Lauren. And then thank you very much for sharing with us, your starting point, in terms of your career, your graduate study, but also, your life experience as well. So I think definitely that's a great context, to think about the unrecognized labor in the cinema, but also in our life in general as well. So that said, there's another question about your interaction with the stunt workers. You mentioned that you were on site and then you talk with them, interviews, so on and so forth. So let me read this question. So the question is from Sarah Shinwood from UCSC History Department. So dear Lauren, totally fascinating, thank you. I wonder whether you learn anything about the relations among stunt workers as colleagues. For instance, whether they had standards of how they treated one another, secrets they agreed explicitly or technically not to share outside the occupation, or rituals of initiation into the occupation, so on and so forth. So basically some of the insider knowledge. And also, did their solidarity respond to or defend themselves psychologically or socially against their marginalization and the hiding of their labor?
All of these are excellent questions. I've written some other pieces on this as well, because after starting work on the book, I realized I just want to work on stunt people almost all the time and almost everything I do. So yeah, when I spoke to them personally, I learned a lot about how they get into the business and how they help others get into the business. My second book is going to be on stunt training and networks. But in terms of the information that they shared with me, there are secrets that they keep, and that connects to the third question, the next question that was asked, which is that they don't talk about their erasure. They talk about it with me because they have a level of comfort with me. I try to be personable, and they have a level of comfort with me, and they talk to me like I'm a real person, and I talk to them like we're friends. And they tell me about, it's hard to work with this actor, or because they take credit for my work, or it's not, or this actor didn't take credit for anything. And often they'll say, I just don't want to talk about that. But I got to tell you, I know a lot of stories that I can't share with the academic community because, and I'm sure someone in history would really understand this, you have to really preserve the, not just there, when you're preserving the anonymity of your sources, sometimes you just cannot tell certain stories, even if they're important to the history of labor and to people finding out the degree to which people are marginalized in the industry. Some of the biggest Hollywood stars, most famous for doing their own stunts, I could tell you stories about them that would make you angry for days because they don't. And in many instances, they have been quite horrible to the stunt people who are doing that work for them. In terms of the stunt people themselves, I mean, how they get into the industry is kind of an interesting thing. It's really regionally and locally specific. In some places there are schools, but mostly in most instances, and this is true in Hong Kong, in mainland China, in New Zealand, in Hollywood, it starts from familial ties. So stunt work in the US, it kind of harkens back to Wild West shows and to what else, to the circus. There's actual historical connections between these things. And those communities, they pass down skills within families, and the same thing happens in stunt communities. But over time, those stunt families gain power within their local industry, and they try and give all the jobs to all of their cousins and nephews. I'd say nieces, but that only, for women, it only happens in certain contexts where they tend to get work as well. So it's really very hard to infiltrate these industries if you're an outsider. Increasingly, there are these schools that you can go to where you can train, but only if the person who runs that school is very well networked and connected can they help you to actually get work in the industry. One such place is Ireland, where people actually, there's an excellent stunt school in Ireland that is training the next generation of people whose fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers weren't stuntmen to try and get work. And they're showing them how to acquire those skills. That's why they were lighting me on fire, because they were teaching these like 19-year-olds, 25-year-olds, how to get safely lit on fire, how to fall down the stairs safely. So they do share their skills. They are very, very kind. It's a very odd situation where all of the stunt people I've interacted with have been exceptional, have shared their learning techniques with me, have wanted to show me how to do things, but there's also these other entities in the stunt universe that are from these families with long-standing connections to their local stunt community, and they don't want newcomers to come in, and they don't want to share the secrets. So I feel like I'm talking at you in circles. I hope I've answered all of your questions. If not, you can email me. I'm very happy to talk about these things.
Thank you, Lauren. And then especially you mentioned this training school that teach, like safety, like how to perform the stunt work safely. And I guess this related to our next question is about the quote unquote authenticity. So this is a question from Thomas Baker. And so let me read the question. Right. Okay, some writers and fans have discussed the return to authenticity in martial arts cinema, moving away from wire work and CGI to a kinetic style, such as Tony Jaa or Iko Uwais. What are your thoughts on this? And then Professor Fu, also feel free to join us and jump in about your thoughts about this issue or this kind of return to the authenticity.
So I'll say a little, and then I'll give time for Professor Fu to say much more interesting and brilliant things than I'm about to tell you. So I think it's difficult. People often position wire work as inauthentic, and that's problematic because it takes an extreme amount of skill to do it well. And the people who do it best are dancers and gymnasts and people with Peking opera training and Cantonese, strongly Peking opera training, but Cantonese opera training as well. There's a reason why Hong Kong style wire work, even though it's done so much more cheaply and less safely, looks better than the more expensive work that gets done elsewhere. And that is because of the skill and training of the performers and the years of work they put into that. But in terms of a return to authenticity, I think like markets get bored by seeing what they assume to be the same thing over and over and over again. So yes, has been a shift in action design styles. One of the things that's coming up, there's usually regional specificities, but one thing that's really making its way everywhere is tricking. So tricking is a kind of martial arts, gymnastics, breakdancing combination. And there are tricking gyms popping up at all of the major cities where you have big stunt communities. And people who can do tricking don't need the wires to achieve the height to get the kicks. So it's kind of in that way return to authenticity in that there are no wires, but it's not necessarily a very specific style of martial arts. It's so American in this way that it's mixed. It's not mixed martial arts, but it's like mixed between breakdancing, gymnastics, usually maybe some wushu. Often there's, because of the West Coast connection, you see a lot of like Filipino martial arts that are involved there, because Inosanto runs an academy out there down in Inosanto, and it affects the kinds of martial arts that people tended to do in Hollywood. So yeah, tricking is really making a comeback. But if we look at like the mainland Chinese or Hong Kong as an example, or Malaysia, Korea, Thailand, like people are returning to their authentic styles, but they're never actually authentic in that you really have to change. Jackie Chan has talked about this. You really have to adjust how you perform something for the screen. That being said, there are people like, were people like Lo Garlang who, were specialists in particular forms and were very, very invested in making sure they were represented accurately on screen. But that's not really what we're seeing so much now. We're really seeing more dynamic work without wires. And most of that is connected to tricking. I'm going to be quiet now.
Well, I don't have much to add to this. I think Lauren said it very much. I think I agree with most of what she said. I think it really depends on what you mean by authentic. in what sense? And I think, at least Hong Kong movie always thought that they're trying to do action movie, always thought that they're going to be authentic. But then for others would say that Hong Kong films, action films, always, even with Jackie Chan, Sammo Hung, and all others, there's a very strong operatic dancing feeling to it. And not to say about Wire and I think Ada Flight, and I think those are really used to enhance the cinematic feeling. I don't know whether we can really get rid of all those things. And then I think the issue right now, the critics in China were the most critical of Hong Kong film as not authentic. But then I would say that what you mean by authentic, like a Jet Li when he first came out, that when he made the 1980s, the Shaolin, that they thought that they was much more authentic than the Hong Kong action movie that was so hybridized and also so operatic. So I don't have much to add. I wonder whether it's possible to be completely get out of all this wire work, all this harass and all the things. And then I think as Pen, he said one thing is very true. He said that for any Hong Kong style action movie, even when it was made in the US or others, if without the Peking opera staging feeling, it would be just like, why don't you just go to watch a boxing or MMA? So I think that is one thing to say. But at the same time, is that authenticity, or you can also argue, is almost like very much like a historical authenticity. That's always been talked about a lot. So this is what I just want to weigh in, but I basically agree with what Lauren just said. There was a teaching school right now in China. In fact, just one question I want to ask Lauren is that when you write your book, do you want to write a chapter on the mainland China? Because that was exactly what is main thing argued about, authenticities. So China claimed itself to be the real home of Chineseness. That is what the movie should be about. And then right now, Jackie Chan, Cui Hak all went to China, make all these movies. So what they like, and they created schools to teach martial arts and for movies. So I would think that authenticity could be discussed in that way. But I would first think that really what they mean by authenticity to begin with when it comes to this question. But I think it's a very great question. I think that too. Yeah.
So can I respond to that? So I agree that it's a great question. I desperately wanted to write a chapter on mainland China, but I thought that it wouldn't be equal to the other chapters because I connected with some stunt people over there, but people were not being forthright. They were not being honest about their answers. And I found out a lot about the mainland Chinese context from Hong Kong stunt people. And mind you, they are jaded because the work is now going to mainland China. But in terms of speaking to authenticity, like if you watch wire work from mainland China compared to Hong Kong, the work in Hong Kong was being done by everyone on the team. Everyone was pulling the wires to get it as accurate. Everyone worked all night. In mainland China, according to most of the research that's been done and everything I heard, there's a very strict division of labor where stuntmen are like, I'm not going to pull a wire. I'm a stuntman. I'm not going to get involved in that. So you actually have very rigid, like, I have a position. I'm not going to stoop to do what these people are doing. And because of that, it's just so regimented and controlled. And some would say, and I would say definitely, you can see it in the wire work. You can see it in the wire work when you watch a Chinese production. There's so much control in it that it's lost and I know people who don't like wire work won't understand this, but authenticity, because it's the flaws that make Hong Kong wire work beautiful. It's it's the team effort to get it on screen. You can see it, you can feel it. And maybe I'm just full of it, but you can see the difference between Hong Kong wire work in all of its imperfections, and this desire to just have things look as perfect as possible to compete with Hollywood when you look at mainland Chinese action productions. It really breaks my heart.
Thank you, Lauren, and also thank you, Professor Fu, for the question. Actually, that's what I was thinking about as well when we think about authenticity, and also thinking about the development of martial art cinema, and then thinking about that dimension, and then also, China, the force and also presence of China. So I believe we are moving toward the end, but before we conclude the talk today, I do want to get to one of the questions. This is about gender. And then I want to highlight the female stunt performers. And then this is one of the questions submitted by Selena Huang. So the question is about the female stunt performer, and especially how gender has affected their line of work.
Okay, so it depends a bit on national context, but I can give you, how about Hollywood? I'll tell you a little bit about Hollywood and how it's affected them. It's been very difficult because the union, the Screen Actors Guild, which is now SAG-AFTRA, they have represented stunt people and actors since their inception in the early 1930s. And the difficulty is when your union represents the people that like to claim your labor, they don't really pay as much attention to stunt people's needs. So they tended to take this, the union tended to take its direction from the major stunt performers of the era. So in the 1950s to 60s, stunt work starts to become more formalized. There are these fraternal organizations, like a whole bunch of guys get together and form the Stuntmen's Association. And they really control the industry because SAG just calls them up and says, we need a coordinator, we need stuntmen, and they just hire their own. So they kept women and racial minorities out of the business. And then in the late 60s, around 1960, between 63 and 67, there were organizations like the Stunt Women's Organization of Motion Pictures and the Black Stuntmen's Association, which also had women in it. And they started to train women and train racial minorities to do stunts and fought to try and get them work in the industry. But the Screen Actors Guild, they wouldn't create a policy that said that you couldn't have a stuntman double for a woman, or you couldn't have a white stuntman double for a Black performer. These things are called wig downs and paint downs in the US. They still go on today. They created a very soft policy that's existed since the 1980s and been revised slightly, where they have to try to find someone to who matches the race and gender of the actor that being doubled, but they don't try very hard, or they try in ways that get minority and women stunt people killed or injured, because they'll have them do a stunt just to demonstrate they're not skilled enough because they haven't called the right person in to do the stunt. It is much harder to be a woman in the business, in the stunt business anywhere, but there are locations, like I found out, like Ireland, where if you've worked hard enough and long enough in the business and people have seen that you're skilled, they give you a chance. So like Emer O'Grady is a major female stunt coordinator in Ireland right now, who's doing a lot of the TV and movies that you might find yourself watching on any of the streaming services, because so much work is being done in Ireland. I'm even going this summer to watch some Netflix TV shows, watch the stunt work being done for those. But like, it really depends on the context, but no matter which context, the guys have historically tried to keep the women out of the business. First, they did it because they were sexist, but now they increasingly do it because they're just so desperate for work that they want to take any work that they possibly can, which isn't to say there aren't sexist people in there, but really it's the competition for work drives people to make stupid decisions. Also, there are just less opportunities to double action for women if there are less films and TV shows with women doing action in them. And the same is true for racial minorities.
Right. Thank you, Lauren. And I see there are still some questions in the chat box, and I wish we have 1 more hour or many more hours to continue the conversation. But we do have to conclude the event here. But we will collect all the questions and then send it to our speakers. So even though we are not able to answer all of them, the speakers will still know your questions and feedback about the event and also about the book itself. With that note, thank you, Lauren, for sharing your amazing work with us. This is just incredible. And also thank you, Professor Fu, for offering insightful comments. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And also a big thank you to our audience for joining us today from different time zone places from around the world and sharing your questions and feedback with us. Please check out our event page, which I just shared in the chat box. And we have 1 more book talk in April. It's about the defectors from People's Republic of China to Taiwan. And we have many other upcoming events hosted by EASC as well. So that's all for today. And then stay safe. I hope to see you guys next time in our event. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Great
you.
event. Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. We enjoy meeting you guys.
Love meeting you.
Yeah.